think there are different ways of how we can look at multilateralism. I mean, we can look at it just in nominal terms. So it's really the action, the coordination or cooperation between actors that are more than two. So it's not bilateral, it's multilateral. Or we can also look at it as an institution. So for example, a famous IR scholar by the name of John Ruggie, who has been not only contributing to the theoretical development of IR, but also has been a UN practitioner. He, for example, defined multilateralism based on three principles, and that for him was indivisibility, non-discrimination, and diffuse reciprocity. And only if these three principles are being fulfilled, then we can actually talk of multilateralism as an institution. And I think there are these two different ways of talking about it. So I'm not so sure I fall into the camp that makes the argument that multilateralism itself is in crisis. Because what we observe actually is that many forms are still being created, even though maybe in terms of international organizations, we have reached a certain kind of peak, as for now at least. The trend is at least stagnating. What I think is more in crisis is the multilateral endeavors, cooperation arrangements that have been sponsored by the US. So many kind of institutions that have been created after World War II with a heavy imprint of US power as well have now or are being challenged either within or also outside of them. So for example, we observe China creating so-called alternative institutions, though we don't know yet whether they actually challenge, say, the IMF or the World Bank, but they exist in parallel now, and the question will be what kind of challenge that is. But I think it's too early to really say it's in crisis per se.
All these discussions about the crisis of multilateralism, what we should keep in mind is that multilateralism has been a remarkably resilient idea and institutional form, the roots of which go back to the 19th century. And over the course of these years, it has taken many different forms, and it has adapted to quite significant changes. If you think about the end of the Cold War, for instance, or the decline of British hegemony and the rise of the American one. And back in the 19th century, multilateralism has been a response to coordination problems. And this is an issue that persists even today and creates an interest in multilateralism as an institutional form. So back in the days with the development of technology, communication, certain questions of trade and transportation, there was a need to come up with a set of accepted rules. There was a need to regulate these issues, and this exceeded the capacity of individual states to do so. Not only mentioning technology, but also the issue of climate change and many issues of security, these require cooperation and coordination well beyond individual state capacities. So this is one thing that creates an enduring interest in multilateralism. The second is the reason that it is always less costly to sustain institutions rather than dismantling them and creating new ones. And multilateralism being the institutional form in place, it is by definition less costly to stick to it rather than abandoning it. And then thirdly, there are certain idiosyncratic characteristics of multilateralism that make it even more adaptive to change than institutional forms in general, and these are the principles of indivisibility, diffuse reciprocity, and non-discrimination. This resilience is also maintained by very creative forms of multilateral arrangements associating other states or other organizations to the activities that they already have, thereby expanding these sets of rules, common objectives, and ways of going about things.
I really think what we observe is exactly like what you say. Like there are more and more different kind of cooperative endeavors that are being created, either on the regional level. Again, China is an actor who is pushing for also regional cooperation, not only with the AIIB, but also it's more and more attached to ASEAN or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but we see this in Africa as well. So what we observe is that there are regional enterprises being done, but also bilateral enterprises, not so much in the field that I study, security maybe, but in other areas like investment treaties where bilateralism is more dominant. But overall, I think it's hard to say whether they are challenging what we already have or actually contributing to it. I mean, certain of these regional and bilateral endeavors are actually subsidiary to, say, the UN, and they're actually strengthening the UN endeavor, and others are challenging it more. So I cannot give a very detailed and nuanced answer, but saying like just to really have a look into how they relate to the existing institutional structures already. I briefly mentioned that what we're observing is a stagnation in the creation of international governmental organizations. I mean, we still have many out there, but it's stagnating. What we observe is that there are, for example, many private-public partnerships that are being created. So where private actors and governmental and IGO actors actually meet. We have this here in Geneva, just behind me, for example, and there are certain ones that have their seat here. We also observe more transgovernmental networks being created. So I think what we observe is more and more layers that are not necessarily global in their membership and that are much more issue-specific. And so I think the multilateral endeavor might actually move in this kind of direction.